Hi, this is Kyle, and we're on to our week 5 topic of exception handling. And there'll be a few videos in this series, and then we'll kind of blur it into events. We're going to look at exceptions, at throwing argument exceptions, and at working with events. Exceptions are inevitable in application development, and really it could be said that all proper application development does include exception handling. You can at least catch unexpected things and make the program react to them in a way you expect. And that's why we see error messages like that something happens thing that we see in Windows 10 sometimes. Anyway, we do see that exceptions can happen when non-numeric input happens that isn't validated, numeric input doesn't match the right type. It can happen that there's values entered that are larger than the space defined, so that can happen when you're working with small data types like shorts. That there's writing issues, especially when associated with a file or a database or a distributed system. And it can also be improper interaction with an object or class due to accessibility. Exceptions themselves, they emerge and you can deal with them. They're objects created out of the exception class or one of its subclasses. And exceptions have properties and methods that can be accessed to provide information on the exception. This link here will access the MSDN page on exceptions. And there's a couple of interesting things worth noting on this page. There's a huge list of subclasses for one thing. You'll want to know that there's properties of an exception. There's one called the message, and it's a message describing the current exception. A stack trace, which gets all the immediate frames on the call stack, as well as one called getType that can get the type of the exception instance. When we're working with exceptions in a controlled way, we use it with a try-catch statement. And that means we're going to try to do something, and when an exception emerges, we'll be able to react to it. So try statements always start with a try and end with an end try. In the first part, you're going to have some statements that you're going to try to run, and then in those statements, it may be that an exception happens, either because you've thrown it or because it just happens as a consequence of the program. Some people already used exception handling in the work in this course, and so you know what that's like. Then you want to catch the exceptions and react to them from the most specific to the least specific possible. Here we've got catch exception name as most specific exception, followed by the next most specific exception. There might be several next most specific exceptions. And then eventually the least specific exception, which will likely be the general exception, or just exception. You can use a finally statement as well, a finally block I should say, that includes any statements you want to use at the end for cleanup. That is optional. If we look at some code to see what this actually looks like, here is a modified version of the payroll example I've been going through in these videos. This is the actual form, and this is where the try-catch block lives. Here we see this is the beginning of a try-catch block. It's nested, and so there's a try. It's going to try and parse the entered value for hours, and if it's non-numeric, a format exception will be thrown. It does say format exception, so that's one of those fairly specific types of exceptions it's going to try and catch. I'm using a nested try here. And the reason for that is to give different kinds of specific messages. So here we're going to try and set a number of hours using a convert to decimal. So no try parse or anything. It's actually using convert, because in the event that this doesn't work, it's just going to it's going to cause an exception. We're going to set the hours here and the rate here. And having these in different try statements is going to allow us to give more specific messages and set focus in a way that makes sense. So if the hours are entered incorrectly, it's not going to set focus to the rate text box. And if the rate is input incorrectly, same thing. Down below, it's going to try and convert the rate, and then it's going to access the properties of the pay object to set those values for the hours and the rate. It'll call the method to find the pay of that object, and use the overwritten toString method of the pay class to output the pay. And here we've got the catch statements. So that first part was the block of statements directly after the try. And now we're looking at the catch, and we're going to catch the most specific, the next most specific, and so on. So here we've got an object argument exception as argument out of range exception. And this is checking that first the hours worked has been entered correctly, and then that the pay rate has been entered correctly, and if not, it's going to provide messages and set the focus appropriately. Next, we've got a format exception. So this is considered the next most specific. So if the rate has been entered in a way that was not numeric and greater than 0, it's going to cause this kind of exception and this kind of message to the user. Next, we've got an overflow exception. It's not necessarily any more or less specific, but it's a different type of messaging. And if that doesn't happen, then the first try, the first nested try group, is going to finish. Now we're in the second try, and we've got the hours exception, and so this is going to catch that the hours are numeric, set the focus. Here we've got an overflow exception for the hours instead of the rate. And down below we've got the general exception as exception. The general exception is going to catch more or less anything that can go wrong at runtime. And this means basically it says serious exception here, and it just says that because this is something no programmer would likely have expected. So it actually uses here the message property of the exception and the get type method of the exception and the stack trace. And it's going to provide as much information as possible because this is an error that we really didn't expect. So this is the most general or least specific exception, and that's why it has such an unusual error message. But this is a lot of information, and this is actually a very good idea to implement. So that's the structure of a try-catch block, and in the next video we're going to look at how we throw our own exceptions.